The Soviet industrialization is like achieving a high-protein diet through cannibalism. That's why Stalin, echoing Lenin's call during war communism for ruthless war against the kulaks, calls for the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. You have a huge famine beginning in the 1930s, where estimates put it around 8.5 million people died, which kind of puts it into perspective when we think about those sort of big numbers that were killed during Nazi Germany. There is this really strange Marxist, I like to use funny terms, but Marxist fetishization of industry, right? Because Marx writes in the 19th century in Britain and Germany, he thinks that factories, manufacturing, is what economic progress looks like.
Hello, welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman. This is the second in a three-part series on the rise and fall of the Soviet economy. Last time, we discussed the Bolsheviks coming to power, war communism and the new economic policy. Today, we'll be discussing Stalin and his approach to economic change. To do so, I'm delighted to be joined by Aymen Aulaiwi, who has written an article on just this topic, which you can find on insider.iea.org.uk, and it's also linked in the description. So, Aymen, how does Stalin change the economy of the Soviet Union when he first becomes a prominent figure in the late 20s?
Well, the grey man that was Stalin, who is often not really viewed as a true intellectual or a leading figure in the revolution, by the 1920s, miraculously has this amazing rise to power, which is mostly driven by the fact that he was the general secretary of the party, which meant he sort of had control of the party apparatus. And I'd say that the clearest way to describe how Stalin changes the economy is he essentially inflicts all the policies that they always wanted to do.
Yeah.
You know, it's sort of the Marxist principles that Lenin sort of developed into different policies within sections of the economy, like the command economy and the commanding heights of the economy. I know that was a lot of commanding and heights and economy. And the forced war against the kulaks and collectivization during war communism. And he essentially synthesizes this into one solid program. So I always like to say that Stalin's change to the Soviet economy wasn't necessarily this big break. I mean, he called it a great break, right? Yeah. But it's not really. Actually, what he's doing is synthesizing a lot of the thoughts and the general direction that the party was already going in. Yeah. So a lot of his economic policy isn't that different from his arch rival Trotsky. The only difference really is that while Trotsky is calling for permanent revolution, which essentially means we still need to force our international neighbors to have revolutions so that they can help us, as Marx prescribed, Stalin is a realist, and supported by Bukharin, he calls for socialism in one country, which essentially means that we have to build socialism here first before we can inspire others to take the leap. So he's ultimately a synthesizer. He's ultimately a continuation, from Marxist principle to Leninist policy to Stalinist execution. He just executes it in a much more brutal way than anyone would have thought.
Yes, and in a much more literal way as well.
Yeah. So what he does is, starting in 1928, his first big step is to in agriculture, which this kind of resolves a lot of the problems we've been discussing in the last videos, as if we're still here because we're all wearing the same clothes. And but the what the problem was this issue of the peasants, right? Believing they're highly successful under NEP, and that's a risk to the socialist system because they view them as petty bourgeois. The market exists, which they believe is inherently bad. So you have this growth of this idea of primitive socialist accumulation, which is introduced by Prigozhinsky, which is that if we seize these assets and the capital from the peasants and use that capital to force industrialization, Then we can achieve industrialization that way. But also in the process, force collectivization of the peasants.
Yeah.
And
what is collectivization? This is a term that's often sort of thrown around without, I think, sometimes people really having a sense of what it means in practice.
So collectivization is the process whereby, so let's say you owned your own private plot and you had your neighbor own private plot. These guys would come in and they would say, look, you, all of you in this village, now collectively own all this land. None of you are private owners. You all own it together. And you're basically going to manage it as a collective, right? So you force them to become private proprietors to essentially one of many who own the land, right? And this literally went from everything of not just the land, but also cows, sheep, it would all be collectively owned. Famously, one of these wily Soviets goes into, Red Guards go into these villages, and they say to these, says to the peasant, you must collectivize, you must amalgamate your land, and you must collectively run it as a group. And he goes, but please, my wife does not wish to socialize her cow, because who gets the milk if it's socialized, right? Yeah. Because it's hard to determine who owns the milk and who's not, because it's collectively owned. And the land would have to be collectively farmed and managed. So that's collectivization. But within the collectivization drive, it's not like every peasant's allowed to be a part of this new collective. They want to essentially seize a lot of the land and kill a lot of what they call the kulaks, which are the really rich peasants, basically the most productive ones.
Yeah.
And so that's why Stalin, echoing Lenin's call during war communism for ruthless war against the kulaks, calls for the liquidation of the kulaks as a class, which eventually gets the phrase dekulakization. So he forces this huge war on the more productive peasants, which were essentially any peasants who could feed their family sufficiently. So that's hugely disruptive. And I think somewhere... And this causes not only the suffering of killing all the most productive peasants, but also collectivization, collective work, which, by the way, Marx said was more efficient than private ownership, essentially caused a lot of these peasants to become hugely unproductive. Number one, they were already the most unproductive peasants, but they became hugely unproductive because there was no incentive for them to actually produce anything, because they weren't going to get the returns, because most of it would be taken by the state and they would only be able to keep what they can to just stay alive, and barely that. So essentially you have a huge famine beginning in the 1930s, around 1932, where estimates put it around 8.5 million people died, which kind of puts it into perspective when we think about those sort of big numbers that were killed during Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah.
And it's particularly bad in what is known as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine. And it garners the name there, the Holodomor, sort of echoing kind of Holodomor, Holocaust, garners similar imagery, because essentially nearly 3.3 million people are killed because they're not only killing the productive peasants, they're forcing this collectivization process, which caused huge disruption to farming. And so that's part one of what Stalin's economic change is, which is essentially what Lenin tried to do during war communism,
but backed out of with the NEP, essentially,
because he was going to lose the peasants. But by the time Stalin gets to power in 28 and 29, it's hard to determine when he exactly garnered control. The Soviet state has built a very strong monopoly of violence, especially under the Cheka, which would then become the OGPU under Stalin, and then later MBD. It sort of constantly changes names. KGB. It's also awfully complex. The Soviets love changing names. It's hilarious. They have built up a very strong police state. They have also radicalized a lot of young people who are willing to, a bit like the Cultural Revolution in China, who are willing to essentially go out and kill people. So that's the first stage of the policy. The second is what they're going to do with industry. So no more are they going to have these small enterprises that are privately owned. They're going to completely nationalize all of them, and they're going to be subject to a command economy. And how the command economy worked was that it was, at the top, you'd have an agency called Gosplan, which is the State Planning Committee, which was actually founded under Lenin. And similarly, it was essentially expanding what Lenin tried to do with the commanding heights of industry during the NEP. And how it would work is they would introduce these 5-year plans. The first 5-year plan is introduced in 1928. And how this would work is that the State Planning Committee, Gosplan, would set targets for each industry to start producing certain amounts of stuff. So coal industry, we expect you to produce this much coal. Steel industry, which we expect you to within 5 years, right? And giving you sort of yearly points of reference. This would then be passed down to the ministries. So the ministries now control these different sectors, and they're mostly focused on heavy industries. So you have the Ministry for Coal, you have the Ministry for Steel. I believe the post-war Labour government had similar structures in place. So what they then have to do is they take these plans and they pass it down to the sub-departments of their ministries, who then draw up plans for the enterprises, these factories. And they are then told to produce this much or this much within a given year. And then the enterprise has to actually enforce this. So that's how a command economy works, which is very different to how we think of as a free market economy. Because in a free market economy, as we know, things are allocated by the free exchange between, buyers and sellers, between, everything is determined by supply and demand. Resources are allocated, prices are set because of supply and demand forces. Whereas in a command economy, where resources go, what the prices are, how much is to be produced is set by a central planner.
So all of that is set essentially by Gosplan in negotiation with the various ministries, and then it sort of cascades down. How well does this work in practice?
Not very well. And so there is the way to kind of break this down is to sort of think about why this doesn't work from a sort of economic theoretical perspective. It's a very Austrian school thing to do. Not to say that I fully subscribe to the Austrian school, but I find it actually just the best way, because you can soon find out it's very nonsensical. And so the three main problems with a command economy is, one, the issue of information's asymmetries, or it was also called the problem of economic calculation. Two, something called soft budget constraints, which is produced by a Hungarian economist called János Kornai in the 1980s. And then the third problem is a principal agent problem, which any students have studied economics has probably stumbled across that one already. So the first problem, which is the problem of information asymmetries. So it's quite complicated to get your head around, but in a capitalist economy, like I said, things get allocated because of supply and demand forces, right? I produce something because I believe people want it.
And they're willing to pay for it.
And it's mediated by the scarcity of what I can produce, right? But, so what I'm doing is I'm responding to the information that I'm receiving from demand in the economy, right? So information is freely flowing towards me. However, within the command economy, they're not only not able to listen to this, so I'll get onto why they can't understand the information even from its purest perspective, but they don't care about this info. They don't care about demand.
Yeah.
Because what does Stalin want? He wants industrialization. He wants big factories. And I think that's because of two reasons. One, because militarization. The fear of the war with the imperialists who, the capitalist powers, in his view, that is coming. So we have to actually arm ourselves. And two, because there is this really strange Marxist, I like to use funny terms, but Marxist fetishization of industry, right? Because Marx writes in the 19th century in Britain and Germany, he thinks that manufacturing is what economic progress looks like, which of course is very different to what it will eventually look like, which is, technology sectors and service sectors. So maybe Stalin and Trump will share something there in their love for big pounding machines. But so what the command economy is geared towards is not responding to market demand, this information that's coming from people, or even the suppliers. They're focused on something called the priority principle. And the priority principle is when you say that we're going to prioritize the production of heavy industrial goods. And so what are you not producing a lot of? consumer goods, right? Goods that people use, right? I do not buy sheets of steel off a catalogue. Unfortunately, I'm not a welder.
Yeah.
But I do buy lamps and hex bugs.
Yeah.
Oh, there was a fun little tech thing for children back in the day.
Yeah.
Right. So that is something I would buy, but I don't buy heavy sheets of steel. So what's being produced is not really what people want. And it's worsened by what's known as the material balance system, which is that if there's any shortfall in what needs to be produced in the priority sectors like steel and coal, then you'd have to take resources away from the lower priority industries like clothes, textiles, and redistribute them back to the heavy industries that have priority. So you're creating this economy that essentially is not responding to what people want, to the information within the economy, and is essentially producing steel that is just had the value of being steel and producing even more factories and even more industrial goods.
Because there is this target being handed down from
Gosplan.
Gosplan and ultimately Stalin. Yeah. I like steel. I want more
steel. He's literally the man of steel.
Well, yeah.
But there's a very interesting debate that comes about amongst economists in the 1920s and 30s called the debate over economic calculation, which has the longest word in German. It was one of those horrible compound words that I couldn't say. And I think your colleague Christian.
Well, we'll need to get Christy
to help us with that one.
He can dub it in.
Yeah. But what they say is, okay, maybe if you get rid of this priority principle, a command economy might actually be able to simulate a capitalist economy while getting rid of all these sort of, all the classic problems that happens with markets, which is, huge booms and busts, oversupply, which, in my view is actually always caused by some form of terrible government intervention. But that's a much more nuanced point that has to be discussed elsewhere. So you have two main economists who argue this. One is Oscar Lange and the other is Abba Lerner. And Lerner specifically says, you can simulate this market economy because you can set all these targets, and then if something is clearly oversupplied or something's clearly overdemanded, you just make a quick shift.
Yeah.
Right? And he even argued, which sort of mirrors kind of musings today in the policy sector world, that you can introduce other costs that a market wouldn't consider, like
social costs,
pollution, the classic idea of exogeneity, a negative exogenous factors, externalities. That's it. So he believes you can do this. Well, wow, we found this system, but the people the economists who suggest that this doesn't function, and which has been proven time and time again, not only by the command economy systems, but also by trying to introduce social costs into a market, like carbon taxes, for example, is that the information required to actually respond to supply and demand cannot be centralized. There's too much of it, right? It inherently has to be decentralized, right? This was made by Ludwig von Mises and, of course, Friedrich Hayek, right? Which I believe this institution is very fond of.
Yes.
So Hayek says in the seminal essay in 1945 that ultimately, because information is dispersed and distributed within society, that no one man can actually understand it all. For example, let's say I'm a small business owner, I own a cafe in Newcastle. I don't know why I chose Newcastle, but hey, I love the city. And I figure out that people in my local area, the information I'm receiving is that they really like Dubai chocolate, which is now very big, right? So I say to myself, well, I'm going to start making Dubai chocolate, right? But how does a commissioner in London know that people in Newcastle might be wanting Dubai chocolate? Because actually people in Birmingham might be wanting, poppy seed muffins.
Yeah.
Right? So that information is very localized and dispersed. So that's why they suggest that ultimately only a market economy can allow for perfect information symmetry, because it actually allows supply and demand forces to be responded to in a much more localized level.
And you have real prices that
which acts as signals of what is popular and what isn't.
Yeah.
Right. Or
Rather than
gets us or not.
We even under Stalin, we have a price system, but the prices are also being set by a committee, so they're not
real prices. They don't actually reflect the real value. And I trace this back to a very specific problem of Marxism, which comes from Marx himself. And this is a very nuanced point that many critics of Marx, I think, fail to make in their adjuncts to socialists and Marxists, which is that Marx has a very outdated theory of economics, namely his use of the labor theory of value, which was actually developed by Ricardo. People would consider, Ricardian theory and sort of comparative advantage is an inherently free market idea. But he believes that the value of things like this Diet Coke, which, as you can tell, I've been scoffing down, or this glass, is based on the amount of labor that went into the product, right?
So 10 hours of labor went into the Diet Coke, or 10 minutes of labor, it's worth
10x. Yeah, x being the value of your labor.
Yeah,
which who knows how that's determined. That's sort of links back to land value, but it's very complicated, right?
Yeah,
it's the food and the clothes that you need to simply exist.
Yeah,
that's how Marx would conceive as that value. So let's say it takes £10 for me. Oh, £10. All right, living in London, it takes me £50 to live a day.
Yeah,
or maybe that's even too high. To live a day in London. So therefore, this is worth. If I worked 8 hours on this, it would be worth 8 times 5, which is £400. So just making sure I can remember my maths.
Yeah.
So
8 times 50, presumably.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So this is the thing about economists. Calculators do most of our work now. But the problem with the labor. So he views this labor theory of value as okay. Well, what's capitalism's role in this? Well, what it is this is worth, let's say, £400. And I, as the capitalist, the evil capitalist, with big moustache and monocle, am going to pay you the work of £350 and pocket £50 for myself as profit. So it's exploitation. That's what he means by the exploitation of capitalists. Because actually, you produced all this and the capitalist hasn't given anything. He's just there to steal it. But what is missed from the labor theory of value is, of course, the huge contribution that capital does make to economic growth, namely the complex machinery that I had to purchase in order to create this item, but also the entrepreneurial risk I've taken to start this business. So that is inherently present within the value of something. But the key problem, which was already being addressed at the time of Marx's writings by economists like William Stanley Jevons and Alfred Marshall, is that this is a very supply-side view of how something is produced. You also have to understand that things have to respond to demand. Things actually need to be wanted. Right, that sort of information problem. And because Marx doesn't account for this, that the fact that actually something, I could produce this for £400, but if no one's in the market for cups, it has no value. Yeah, right? So that's sort of the problem that the command economy has, right? And the socialists have their view, the Soviets have, but also socialists. They think of products as purely a product of labor, but actually it's a product of labor and capital, but also how much demand is going into that product. So, but there's a big contradiction. Marx says capital is exploitation, but capital is fundamental to economic development and innovation. So he recognizes that point because he says that capitalism is required to create socialism, the material abundance. So he recognizes capital's crucial role, but simultaneously saying it's inherently just exploitative and has no real value. So that's huge contradiction is passed to the Soviets. So that when they're producing this command economy, right, they're heavily focused on producing higher output to create material abundance. But actually, when we looked at the archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union at Stalin's archives, we found that he's not focused too much on output. He's focused on the investment level, the capital accumulation level, which is hilarious, right? It sounds like a capitalist, right?
Yeah. Well, you make exactly this point in your article. You say Stalin is a capitalist.
Well,
and this is actually quite a good question because you've been talking about Marxist theory. How important is this to Marx? To Stalin rather? Is he being heavily influenced by Marx in a real way, or is he totally diverging from it?
Well, people often, the criticism that Trotsky leveled against Marx in his 1936 article. Stalin, sorry. Trotsky would never criticize Marx. Yeah. He, in The Revolution Betrayed in 1936, he says, or 35, either one of those, he says that, Stalin was never a real thinker, he's not an intellectual, he doesn't understand Marx, he doesn't understand Lenin. Stalin was a proficient reader of Marx and Lenin.
Yeah.
There's a paper from 2022, I believe, by a guy called Roberts, and he discusses this amazing, library where, Stalin's a really keen reader. And I always say to people on the left, it's like, you're always saying, oh no, I understand Marx better. Stalin didn't understand Marx. Come on, you understand Marx better than Lenin and Stalin? These guys, this is the labor of love here. They're actually, implementing a lot of this. So what Marx sees is this inherent contradiction, and he has to resolve it, which is he's focused on capital accumulation, that you need this inherent growth of capital. Stalin.
Yeah.
It is believe that you need this capital accumulation to create, economic development, because you're constantly reinvesting in the economy, which is true. But in that process, linking back to my points about the information asymmetries, they purposefully, so they're not even trying to respond to the demand of the economy as Abba Lerner or Oscar Lang would have wanted. They're actually purposely restricting consumer consumption. They're keeping wages low. So they're being that exploitative capitalist to a further extent, if it ever existed, in the capitalist context. And they are suppressing them in order to ensure that the priority principle is upheld to heavy industry.
To pour this surplus back into investment in building up heavy industry.
Yeah, and it was something like 40% of savings, so everything was produced, 40% would be re-put into the economy, right? So very little was actually given to the people. And like I said, you weren't buying sheets of steel. So that's the first big problem with a command economy. The second big problem is something called soft budget constraints. And soft budget constraints is a very interesting economic theory, which is yet to be, I think, explored in more modern contexts. But it essentially means that it's essentially the problem of moral hazard. If you say to your nationalized industry, I will give you money no matter what happens, you will receive money because you are my priority, then there is no incentive for them to use that money wisely. They're not efficient. They have soft budget constraints. Whereas if you have a hard budget constraint, you're forced to be efficient, right? So if I gave you, I don't know why I would do this, but if I give you £100 to start a lemonade stand, right, and I said, even though nobody buys your lemonade, I'll constantly give you 100 quid, you're basically going to be like, well, there's no reason for me to be efficient or, try and improve the quality of my lemonade because I'm always going to have money flowing into me.
Yeah.
Whereas if I give you £50 and I said that's the only £50 you're going to get to start a lemonade stand, you're forced to be efficient and innovative. And so this kind of mirrors, and this is a very nuanced point, the issues of state industrial policy seen in the West, like under Trump, where, if they're going to do everything is humanly possible to reshore American industry and throw money at that problem, it might actually mean that they're not as efficient because they're not really forced to be efficient. They're just, they're just being told to stay in place. And Ruchir Sharma, in a recent book called Why Capitalism Has Failed, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, and he's a sort of FT columnist, he's a hedge fund manager, he's a very, very smart guy. He says that actually today the biggest problem we're having in terms of soft budget constraints is through monetary policy. Because we have this big flow of easy money into the economy, especially after COVID. And
you get zombie companies
that are popped up, and they don't need to be efficient. Like there was stories of Meta, hiring people just for the fact that they wanted to hoard the labor so competitors don't have them, not because it actually helped their production in any way. So that's the second problem. The third problem, which is the key problem of the economy, is the principal agent problem. Now, a principal agent problem, as you might know, which I'm sure you know, is when the principal, the employer, let's say, has a set of directives he wants. He wants you to produce this much stuff. But the agent doesn't want to do that, the employee. And the cost of me monitoring that agent is quite high.
Yeah.
So there is a disjunct between what these two groups of people want. And this is made really severe in this system for three key reasons. One, because there's no consumer goods. So even if I work hard and make lots of money, I'm not going to pay anything with it. I'm not going to buy anything with it.
There's very little to spend your money.
Spend my money on. So why would I work hard? I'm going to shirk. I'm going to lie. Oh, did you do this much work today? Yeah, I did it. Yeah, I mean, most students probably relate to that. So that's the number one problem, the first problem. The second problem is that the system inherently enforces this through what is called a ratcheting up process. Because how Gosplan works is, if you achieve your set plan for 1 year, they'll increase it by 3% the next year. So they'll keep on. It's a year-on-year increase, a ratcheting up effect.
Yeah.
Now, if in a capitalist economy I had the same model, I was a company manager, I said you have to increase 3% on every year, you'd be like, oh, yeah, great. If I fail to do that, if the person fails to do that, well, you just fire them, right? Because they haven't done a good job. But in this system, it's not like you're getting fired. The cost is you're getting shot, right?
Well, that is a pretty heavy disincentive.
Yeah, so it's a huge... but what does it incentivize? It incentivizes you to lie. Not only by fabricating how much you're making, so you're saying, oh, actually, I did produce this much, because if you say you didn't, then they're going to shoot you. But two, you're actually working a little less harder. And why are you doing that? Because you're trying to give yourself a safety cushion. Right? Because let's say that your production possibility frontier, which is just how much stuff you can produce at maximum capacity, is at a certain level, let's say 100 tons of coal. You want to put a bit of a discount on that to ensure that for every increase year on year, you can make that up knowing that you have that safety cushion. So you produce a little less, and you tell them that you produce that little less, right? Because
next year it's going to be 3% higher, or in some of these periods 5%.
Yeah, and it gets in substandard, it's even higher.
Yeah,
and so this ratcheting up effect even gets worse when in 1935 Stalin introduces the Stakhanovite movement, which is based off this guy called Stakhanov, who's a largely fictional character.
Yeah,
so we're not quite sure if I mean, he did
apparently mines
227 tons of coal
in like 8 hours.
Which is ridiculous, and it's sort of like 14 times his quota, which is a complete fabrication.
Yeah.
And so this movement is all about, workers, go out and be a Stakhanovite, just mine to your heart's content for the common good.
Yeah.
But the problem with that is it intensifies that ratcheting up effect. Because if you do really well one day and you reach that maximum, they expect more the next day. And yeah, guess what? A good Stakhanovite is a dead Stakhanovite the next year.
Right.
So that's the second problem. And then the third problem, which is even more funny, is the coercive problem. So the monitoring would be their coercive power. So they say to themselves, right, okay, so what we'll do is we'll punish you if you don't reach this goal, and we know you're lying, so if you lie, we'll also punish you. Okay, Stalin's actually he understands a lot of this principal agent problems. He can never quite link it back to the economic system. He just thinks they're spies, the Western influences. And this is shown by the Shakti trials of 1928, where he puts all these top engineers on trial. And the problem here is that it bears no relation to reality. The monitoring, the information exchange is so poor that actually, if you're this coercive element, who was the OGPU or the factory managers had to report on these people, or even the workers had to report on the factory managers, there was no definitive way of proving whether they were actually shirking or not.
Because all of the figures are somewhat unreliable.
None of the figures are reliable. People are lying, and people also just use this as an opportunity to settle personal gripes. I want a promotion. Hey, my manager is not following the plan. So essentially what he does is, he gets rid of him and then he gets the promotion. And so what happens is the coercion that's meant to resolve this principal agent problem becomes random.
Yeah.
And it just makes the principal agent problem worse, because why the hell should I work hard if the chances of me being shot are random?
Yeah. Okay, so that all makes sense and seems very intuitive to most people. But what sort of soft defenders of Stalin sometimes argue is that
Tanky Twitter.
Well, even not just tanky Twitter. So you get some people who are very willing to acknowledge that you know the Great Terror was very excessive. There are a lot of cruelties involved in collectivization. But they say, but aside from this, there does seem to have been a significant increase in various industries. There does seem to have been, an increase in agricultural output. And some of them will say, look, this was essentially necessary in order to be able to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. If you hadn't had this mass ratcheting up of state-directed industrialization, the Soviet Union would have just been conquered by Germany in World War II, and that would have been unimaginably bad. And therefore, okay, that is a sort of utilitarian case for Stalin on those grounds. What do you make of that?
So, I mean, this is something that I think I confront quite a lot, which is, this idea that actually, look, post-Stalin, you have all these new hydroelectric plants, these new cities, Magnitogorsk, these huge infrastructure projects. You have
the Moscow Metro,
which is very nice. I never denied the beauty of Soviet artists.
Yeah,
but it's only in the fact that they, got some good incentives, and they were also personally expressing themselves through art, even if they were forced to do Stalin. But the problem with this point of view is that one, on agriculture, I'm afraid there is no evidence to suggest that agricultural production increased or improved. If anything, it substantially got worse. And the proof of this is, if you ignore the statistics, which are evidently fake, because of all the lying and the principal agent problems, if you look at the heights, which is the best measure of agricultural output, and you know why height's the best?
As in heights of people? Oh, right, okay. So you can calculate how much they're consuming during childhood.
Yeah, because,
you can't fake it.
You can't fake it.
Yeah.
Right? You can't fake your nutrition levels.
Yeah.
And if you look at the heights during this period in the 30s, they go down. Especially relative to US levels.
Yeah.
I think sort of by the mid-1930s, Soviet children are growing at 6% the rate that American children are growing.
Wow.
Which is criminally small. Right? So that's the agricultural side. On the actual industrial output side, yeah, okay, you can produce huge amounts of output. And let's say we have these GDP figures, which, by the way, I never use as a point of principle, and this is why. You can say I produced this much stuff, this many sheets of steel, this much tons of coal. But what is the value? The actual value of what is being produced if nobody wants it or uses it, right?
Yeah.
You can produce these big towering steel mills and hydroelectric plants, but when most of the country is not electrified, when a lot of villages are not electrified, where the steel is basically rusting on the side of the roads, they're making tractors that no one knows how to use. What is the actual, because GDP, when we think of GDP, it's the value of everything that's produced, not consumed, produced. And because of that, that means a lot of this stuff was not consumed. It was not produced because anyone demanded it. It was just produced because vibes, So for me, I say, yes, you could produce all this stuff, but ultimately, it doesn't actually benefit anyone. It's not. What's the point of growth if it's not for consumer welfare? If it isn't actually to improve the living standards of people, right? And so, which is a point that many leftists say today. And I think, well, do you not see this point happening in Stalin as well? And I believe it was John Sargent and maybe another economic historian of this period who famously said that, the Soviet Union industrialized. The Soviet industrialization is like achieving a high protein diet through cannibalism.
Right.
Because the amount of deaths required and the amount of the lack of consumer welfare the squeezing of consumer welfare required. By the way, consumer welfare is just citizens' welfare. Consumers are people. People are consumers. And so that amount of suffering just to produce all these plants for nothing, right? Because they're not actually producing anything people want. And to prove that point, look at what happens when the Soviet Union collapses. What was being produced by this command economy was rubbish.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted it. Russian cars, Russian clothing. It was absolutely rubbish, right? So you built all these systems, but they're not producing what people want, and it doesn't measure up to what's being produced in the West, because Britain went through the same, even more impressive industrialization through 200 years. The US eventually caught up, and then the rest of Europe, through much less bloodletting.
Yeah.
So for me, it's a theological point, right? Yes, I might agree that output increased by this much, but for what end?
Yeah.
And that's why Stalin's economy, the command economy that would eventually continue in the Soviet Union, I just describe as an empire of rusting steel and rotting corpses, as is signified by the building of the Belomor Canal, or the White Sea Canal, during the early 30s, where around 25,000 slave laborers who came from the gulags, which were, the main systems of coercion and slave labor in the country, died to produce this canal. And you can say, oh, it was very impressive because, Sidney and Beatrice Webb went down the river, who were big Stalinist apologists. It's amazing how far the LSE has come. But they essentially said, oh, look at this amazing canal. The canal was way too shallow for any real shipping. And also, who the hell is shipping between the White Sea and the Baltic?
Yeah.
So, it's an empire of rusting steel and rotting corpses, nothing more.
Okay.
Sorry to end on that somber news. Yeah.
No, I suppose it's to be expected when you're dealing with Stalin. Anyway, thank you for this episode. Next time will be our final episode in this series, and we will be finally getting to the fall of the Soviet Union, from Khrushchev on to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. If you haven't done it already, do look in the description and follow the link to the article on which our discussion was based. But
Very good.
Yeah.
And
I agree. It's really good. Anyway, das Vidania.